At 57, 3 weeks after she buried a husband she had been quietly planning to leave, Maren Ellison sat at her kitchen table with $211 in her checking account, a folded sheet of county paper she had found tucked between the pages of his Bible, and the slow, sinking understanding that she had spent 31 years sleeping beside a stranger. The paper was a deed. 2 acres on a bend of the White River, 11 miles south of town, bought and paid for in Walter Ellison's name alone. She had never heard him speak of it once, but what nobody in Sawyer's Bend would tell her, not at the funeral, not at the feed store, not the men who kept showing up at her door with their hats in their hands, was what stood at the end of that gravel road. Behind a padlocked door on land she never knew her husband owned, was the thing that would take apart every assumption she had ever made about the dull, silent man she'd married. And once she found it, she could not put herself back together the same way again. Before we go any further, if stories like this one mean something to you, take a second and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories reach. Now let me tell you about Maren. Maren Ellison had been married to Walt for 31 years, and for the last 9 of them she had been keeping a folder in the bottom drawer of her dresser, underneath the winter sweaters she only wore twice a year. Inside the folder were divorce papers. She had filled out everything but the signature line. She had carried that folder from one apartment to a rented house to the small place on Dollar Street they finally bought outright in 2014. And every time she moved it, she told herself the same thing. Not yet. Not this year, maybe after. They had met in 1992 at a fish fry the volunteer fire department put on every Labor Day back when Maren was 25 and waiting tables at a diner on the highway and Walt was 27 and already driving for the gravel company. He hadn't said much that night either. He'd just kept refilling her tea glass without being asked, the whole evening, quiet and steady, until she finally laughed and said, "You planning to drown me?" And he'd gone red to the ears and said, "No, ma'am, I just noticed it was getting low." She married him 14 months later in a borrowed dress, and for a long time the quiet in him had felt like depth. He was a man who watched. A man who noticed when your tea was low. She had mistaken his silence for a still water with something underneath, and for the first 10 years or so she'd been right. The cooling didn't happen all at once. There was no fight, no betrayal she could point to, no single morning she woke up and felt the temperature drop. It was slower than that, and crueler for being slow. It was 1,000 small evenings where she tried to tell him about her day and he said, and kept his eyes on the television. It was the way he never seemed curious about anything, never asked a question, never started a conversation that wasn't about the truck, or the weather, or what was for supper. She'd wanted a partner she could talk to, and what she had was a man who would refill her glass for 30 years without ever once asking what she was thirsty for. By her late 40s she had stopped reaching for him, and he, in his way, had let her. They became 2 people who shared an address and a grocery list and a bed they lay still in, back to back, and the silence that had once felt like depth had come to feel like a closed door she'd quit knocking on. She knows now what was behind that door. That is the part she will never get over. She had thought he had nothing to say, when the truth was he had spent 34 years too ashamed to learn the words, and then 9 more years too ashamed to tell her how he'd finally found them. The closed door wasn't empty. It was just locked from the inside, by a man who had been taught his whole life that what was behind it would make her think less of him. But she didn't know any of that yet, at the kitchen table with the deed in her hands. All she knew for 31 years was that the lights were on and nobody seemed to be home. It wasn't that Walt was cruel. He never raised his voice, never raised his hand, never once in 31 years called her a name. It was that he wasn't there. He worked. He came home. He ate whatever she put in front of him and said it was good. And then he sat in the recliner with the television on low, and his eyes somewhere she couldn't follow. On Sundays he was gone before she woke up. Fishing, he'd say, when she asked, which she stopped doing around year 4. He'd come home at dusk, smelling like river mud and motor oil, and something faintly like chalk dust, though she never thought hard about the chalk. He never brought home fish. She had decided, somewhere in her 50s, that he was having an affair. It was the only explanation that fit. A man does not disappear every Sunday for 12 years to come home with empty hands and quiet eyes, and not be doing something he can't say out loud. She never confronted him. She didn't have the energy for the fight or the grief that would follow it. She just slid the folder a little closer to the front of the drawer and waited for the year She'd finally be ready. Walt died on a Sunday in March. He was 59 years old. They found him a little after noon, slumped over a small wooden desk in a one-room shack on the river, his reading glasses still on, an open book under his folded arms. Maren did not know about the desk or the book or the glasses for almost a week. The man who found him, a heavy-set trucker named Marvin Boyd, whom Maren had never met, told the sheriff, and the sheriff told Maren only that Walt had passed out by the river, peacefully, fast, the way the lucky ones go. She pictured a fishing pole. She pictured a tackle box. She did not picture a book, because in 31 years of marriage she had never once seen Walter Ellison read anything but the back of a cereal box, and even that he held at arm's length and put down quick. The funeral was on a Thursday. Maren had expected maybe 20 people. The pastor, a few of Walt's co-workers from the gravel company, her sister driving up from Conway, the neighbor who watered their tomatoes. She did not expect the church to fill. She did not expect the parking lot of Sawyer's Bend Baptist to run out of room so that men were parking along the shoulder of County Road 9 and walking up in their good boots. She stood at the front in a black dress that pinched at the shoulders and watched a stream of faces she had never seen file past the casket, and every one of them, the old men and the young men and the men her own age with gray coming in at the temples, every one of them stopped and put a hand flat on the wood for a moment before they moved on, like they were thanking him for something. A man about 40 came through the line near the end. He had a little girl on his hip and a wife beside him, and when he got to Maren, he couldn't get the words out at first. He just stood there working his jaw. Finally he said, "Your husband changed my whole life, ma'am. I never told my wife how. I'm gonna tell her tonight." And then he moved on before Maren could ask him what he meant, and the next person was already taking her hand, and the moments slid away from her the way the whole day did, fast and underwater. There were others like him. An old farmer in a suit that no longer fit, who took both her hands in his and said only, he was a fine teacher, and when she said, confused, "Teacher?" the man's face went careful and he said, "Of patience, ma'am. He taught me patience," and moved on. A young man, no more than 30, who stood at the casket so long the line backed up behind him, and who finally pressed his palm flat to the wood and whispered something Maren couldn't hear, and walked out the side door with his head down. A heavy-set trucker she would later learn was named Marvin, who didn't come through the line at all, but stood at the very back of the church the whole service with his cap crushed in both hands and tears running openly down his face, and who was gone before the last hymn ended. Maren stood at the front of that church in her pinching black dress and watched 140 strangers grieve her husband, and she could not have told you the name of a single one of them, and that more than the casket, more than the flowers, was the thing that frightened her. She had been married to this man for 31 years. Who were all these people, and how did they know him better than she did? She didn't cry at the funeral. She had cried already, alone, in the truck in the church parking lot before anyone arrived, and what she had cried about was not grief exactly. It was a tangled thing she didn't have a name for, equal parts sorrow and guilt and a strange hollow embarrassment that she was burying a man she had decided to divorce, and that she could not, standing there, remember the last real conversation they'd had. Something about the gutters needing cleaning. Something ordinary. Something she'd half listened to with her mind already, in the dresser drawer. It was the following Tuesday, packing his things to give to the church, that she found the Bible. Walt kept it on the shelf in the bedroom between a coffee can full of fishing weights and a stack of old Gravel Hall invoices. Maren had dusted around that Bible for years without ever opening it. They weren't churchgoers, either of them, except for Easter and the occasional funeral, and she'd assumed it had been his mother's, kept out of habit more than faith. She took it down to put in the donation box, and when she did, the spine fell open in her hands the way a book will when it's been opened to the same place 1,000 times, and a folded paper slid out and landed on the floor. She picked it up. It was thin from being handled, soft at the creases. She unfolded it under the bedroom light. A warranty deed stamped by the Sawyer County clerk, dated 9 years earlier. 2 acres, parcel 14, Awful Ferry Road on the south bend of the White River. Grantee, Walter James Ellison. Purchase price, $400. She read it 3 times. Her husband had bought riverfront land 9 years ago for $1,400 and never said a single word about it. The same year, she realized with a cold drop in her stomach that she'd first started filling out the folder in the drawer. Behind the deed, still inside the Bible, was a second piece of paper, and this one stopped her breath. It was a hand-drawn map, Walt's handwriting, which she would have known anywhere. Big, careful block letters pressed hard into the page, like every word cost him something. Town to the river, 11 miles. Old Ferry Road circled twice. An arrow east along a line he'd labeled gravel turn, and at the end a small square and the word shack, and beside it 3 words she would spend the next month trying to understand. Keep it open. Maren sat down on the edge of the bed with the deed in one hand and the map in the other, and the donation box at her feet half filled with shirts. And for the first time since the church parking lot, she felt something other than guilt. She felt the floor of her certainty give way. She had been so sure. An affair. A coward who couldn't tell her he wanted out or couldn't be bothered to come home. She had built a whole quiet verdict against him over 12 years of Sundays. And here was a deed she'd never seen, in a Bible she'd never opened, with a map to a place she'd never been, and 3 words in his hand that didn't sound like a man with something to hide. They sounded like an instruction, like he'd known, somehow, that she'd be the one to find it. She did not sleep much that night. Before dawn she made coffee in the dark, put the deed and the map in her purse, and drove the 11 miles south with the heater rattling and the sun not yet up over the ridge. The drive out to the river took her through country she'd lived next to her whole life and never really looked at. Limestone bluffs going pink in the early light, cedar pressing down to the road on both sides, the smell of it coming through the cracked window, sharp and clean. Old Ferry Road turned to gravel after the second cattle guard, and the gravel was the color of dried blood, red Ozark dust that rose behind the truck and hung in the still air. She counted 3 mailboxes in 11 miles. She found the gravel turn where Walt had marked it, a break in the cedar just wide enough for a vehicle. 2 ruts worn deep with use and now beginning to green over down the center where nothing had driven in 3 weeks. She followed the ruts down through the trees and came out on a flat stretch above the river. And there it was. The shack. It was not much to look at. A single room, maybe 16 feet by 20, sided in rough-cut board gone silver gray with weather. A tin roof, rusted at the seams but solid, pitched to shed rain toward the water, a stovepipe poking up through it. A small porch, just a few planks and 2 posts, and a single window on the riverside with real glass in it, catching the morning light. There was a padlock on the door, and sitting on the porch step, watching her with its head tilted, was a dog. It was a medium-sized dog, brown and white, with one ear that stood up and one that flopped, and it was missing its back left leg. It didn't bark, it didn't run. It just sat there on 3 legs and watched her cut the engine and step out into the cold red dust, like it had been expecting her or expecting somebody, and was disappointed but not surprised that it wasn't the man it wanted. "Hey," Maren said softly. The dog thumped its tail once against the plank and went still again. She tried the padlock. Locked, of course. She walked the perimeter of the shack through grass wet with dew that soaked her shoes, past a stack of firewood split and stacked tight under a tarp, past a rain barrel at the corner of the roof, until she came to the river window. She cupped her hands and looked through the glass, and she could not make sense of what she saw. There were chairs. Not lawn chairs, not fishing chairs. School chairs, the old wooden kind with a writing arm, a dozen of them in 2 neat rows facing the front of the room. There was a chalkboard on the far wall, a real one, framed in oak, with words still written on it in Walt's blocky capital letters. There was a shelf, floor to ceiling, packed with books. There was a small wood stove and a blue enamel coffee pot on top of it. There was a desk at the front, and on the desk a book lay open, where someone had set it down and walked away, and a pair of reading glasses lay folded beside it. Walt's glasses, the ones she'd been told he was wearing when they found him. Maren stood at that window for a long time. She did not understand what she was looking at, but she understood it was not what she'd believed. There was no other woman in this room. There was no betrayal she could name. There was a classroom, hidden in the cedar on a bend of the river, and her husband had been driving out to it every Sunday for 9 years, and she had buried him without knowing it existed. If you've made it this far into Maren's story, take a second to hit subscribe, because what she found inside that room is the part I've been waiting to tell you. She drove back to town and went straight to the feed store. Because the store was where you went in Sawyer's Bend when you needed to know something the courthouse couldn't tell you. The man behind the counter was named Royce Tillman, a wide, slow-moving man in his 60s with reading glasses pushed up into thin white hair and a green apron with Tillman Feed and Hardware stitched on the chest. He looked up when the bell over the door rang, and when he saw her face, Something passed over his that she couldn't read. "Mrs. Ellison," he said. He came around the counter. "I'm awful sorry about Walt. I should have come by. He stopped. "I didn't know what to say to you." "Royce," she said, "I need you to tell me something, and I need you to tell me straight." She put the deed on the counter. "There's a shack out on the river on land Walt owned and I never knew about. It's full of school desks and a chalkboard. There's a lock on it I can't open. What was my husband doing out there?" Royce looked at the deed. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he reached up and took off his glasses and folded them carefully and set them on the counter, the way a man does when he needs both hands free for what he's about to say. "You ought to sit down," he said. "I'll make coffee. This is a long one, and it's not mine to tell short." He pulled a stool around for her and poured 2 cups from a percolator in the back and set one in front of her. Then he stood with his hands flat on the counter and told her. "Walt couldn't read until he was 34 years old, Royce said. Maren stared at him. "That's not." She started, and then she stopped, because in 31 years she had never once seen her husband read anything, and she had never let herself wonder why. She'd thought he wasn't interested. She'd thought he was simple. The word sat in her chest like a stone. She had thought for 3 decades that the man she married was simple. "He hid it from everybody," Royce went on. "From you, I expect, most of all. That's how it works with men like Walt. The shame of it, you can't hardly imagine. He left school in the 8th grade, drove a gravel truck 40 years, and he memorized everything. Road signs by shape, invoices by where the numbers sat on the page. He'd hand a delivery ticket to the guy at the quarry and say, 'Read me that back, my eyes are bad,' and that man never once knew. Walt got through his whole working life that way. Faking it, terrified every single day that somebody would find out." Royce took a sip of his coffee. "Then, about 25 years ago, the library down in Mountain Home ran an adult literacy night, one evening a week. A retired school teacher named Ada Finch ran it. Walt drove 40 minutes each way after work for 2 years and never told a soul, not even me, and I'm the closest thing to a best friend that man had. Ada taught him to read. He was 34 when he read his first whole book cover to cover. You know what it was?" Maren shook her head. She couldn't speak. "That Bible," Royce said, nodding at the deed where it lay, as if he could see through it to the book on her shelf at home. Ada gave it to him. He read it slow, a page at a time, sounding it out, for the better part of a year. It about killed him, and it about saved him, both. Royce was quiet a moment, turning his coffee cup in a slow circle on the counter. "He told me once what those first nights were like," he said. "Drove 40 minutes after a 10-hour shift hauling gravel. Walked into that library shaking," he said, "like a man walking into a doctor's office for bad news. Sat down at a table with a woman old enough to be his mother and a stack of picture books meant for 6-year-olds. He was 34 years old, Maren, a grown man with calluses like saddle leather, and Ada Finch put a card in front of him with a picture of a cat and the word CAT under it, and asked him to sound it out, and he said he couldn't get his mouth to work. Said his hands were sweating so bad he left wet marks on the table. Said he came that close to walking out and never coming back." Royce held up his finger and thumb a hair apart. "That close? The shame of it. You can't hardly imagine, for a man who'd spent his whole life making sure nobody ever knew. But he stayed," Maren said. "He stayed. And you know what kept him in that chair? He told me this part more than once, so I know it mattered to him. Ada never once let on it was hard. Never sighed, never rushed him, never looked at him like he was slow. She just sat there like the two of them had all the time in the world, and every time he got a word, even a little word, even cat, she'd say, 'There it is,' real quiet, like he'd done something. And he said it had been so long since anybody'd told him he'd done something, that he'd have read the whole library just to hear it again." Royce shook his head slowly. 2 years he drove out there, learned to read at 34. And every single thing he built later, every rule he wrote on that shack wall, nobody gets laughed at ever. We start at the start no matter how old you are. Every bit of it came straight out of how that old woman treated him. He wasn't inventing nothing. He was passing on exactly what got handed to him. And when he was done learning, you know what he decided? He decided no grown man in this county was ever going to feel the way he'd felt for 34 years if he could help it. So he started teaching. The shack on the river, Royce told her, had started as just that, a place. Walt bought the 2 acres because it was cheap and remote and private. And a man who'd spent his life hiding a thing knew that the men he wanted to hide somewhere, they could come without anybody seeing them walk through a library door in the middle of town. Shame. Royce said was the whole problem. A man would rather his wife think he was a drunk or a gambler or a cheat than know he couldn't read a bedtime story to his own kids. So Walt built them a place out where nobody would see. He told the world he was fishing. The men told their wives they were fishing. And on Sunday mornings, 11 miles south of town, Walter Ellison taught grown men their letters. "How many?" Maren asked. Her voice came out cracked. Royce thought about it. "I don't rightly know the number, but I'd say close to 40 over the years. Maybe more. Truckers mostly. Mechanics, a couple of farmers. Young fathers who couldn't read to their babies and were tore up about it." He kept a book, wrote down every man's name and the day he finished his first whole book on his own. He called it the day the lights come on. That's what he'd say. "I just want to be there the day the lights come on." Maren put both hands flat on the counter and looked at them. 31 years, every Sunday for the last 9. River mud and motor oil and chalk dust, empty hands. She had filled out a divorce folder, while her husband drove 11 miles to turn the lights on in men who'd been living in the dark their whole lives. And he had never told her, because the thing was built entirely out of other men's shame, and a man like Walt would die before he'd spend another man's shame to make himself look good in front of his own wife. "Why didn't he tell me?" she said. "I'm his wife. Why couldn't he tell me one thing about it?" Royce was quiet for a moment. "I asked him that for a moment. Sitting right where you are," he said. Royce's voice caught and he cleared it. He said, "How do I tell Maren I've been lying to her about Sundays for 9 years? She'll hear lying. She won't hear why." He was scared, Mrs. Ellison. Same way he was scared his whole life. He knew how it'd look. And he never could find the front door of that conversation. So he just kept the secret one more Sunday. And then he ran out of Sundays. Maren drove home with the deed on the seat beside her and Roy's spare key to the padlock in her coat pocket because it turned out half the men in town had a key, and she had been the only person who didn't even know there was a lock. She went back to the shack the next morning, and this time she opened the door. Inside it smelled like wood smoke and old paper, and faintly like him. That gravel and cedar smell she'd known for 31 years, soaked into the boards. The 3-legged dog followed her in and lay down under the desk like it had a spot there, which she understood now that it did. She walked between the rows of school desks, running her hand along the writing arms, worn smooth and dark, where dozens of grown men had rested their forearms learning to make their letters. She looked at the chalkboard, where Walt had written, in his hard block capitals, the last lesson he'd never get to give. The quick brown fox, and below it a list of words: Thorolf, Nidbor, Rythiam, the hard ones, the ones that broke the rules, the ones he'd have walked them through patiently one more time. And on the desk was the book he'd died reading, still open, and his glasses beside it. She picked up the book. It was a thin paperback, a child's chapter book about a boy and a horse, the kind of thing you'd give a 3rd grader. There was a slip of paper marking the page, and on the slip in another man's shaky hand was written, "Walt, I finished it. The whole thing, by myself." Marvin Boyd, the trucker who'd found him. Maren understood now why Marvin had been the one out there on a Sunday. He'd been Walt's student. He'd driven out to read his teacher the last page of his first finished book, and he'd found him already gone, slumped over the desk with the lights still on. Under the desk, in a drawer that stuck, she found the ledger. It was a hardback composition book, the cover soft with handling, the corners worn round. She opened it, and there was Walt's handwriting filling page after page, and she sat down in one of the school desks, meant for a grown man learning to read, and she read her husband for the first time in her life. The first page said, "Started April 2015. Below it, rules. 1. Anybody can come. 2. Nobody gets laughed at, ever. 3. You don't tell nobody who you saw here. 4. We start at the start, no matter how old you are." Then came the names, dozens of them, each with 2 dates beside it, the day they came and the day the lights came on. Marvin Boyd came January 2016, lights on November 2018. Tyler Boone came March 2019, lights on December 2019, and a note, "Young man, fast learner, wanted to read to his baby girl, did it." Hollis Pruitt came summer 2017, age 71, lights on spring 2020, and a note, "Oldest yet." Cried when he read the newspaper out loud. Said he'd been pretending 50 years, page after page after page. 41 names Maren counted, 41 men who'd spent their lives faking it, and 41 notes in her husband's careful hand marking the day each one of them stopped being afraid. But it was the last few pages that undid her. Scattered through the back of the ledger, in between the lesson plans and the lists of words, were sentences that weren't about the men at all. They were practice. Walt had been practicing his own writing the way he'd taught the others to practice theirs, and what he'd been practicing, over and over, crossed out and started again, was a letter. To her. Maren, there is a thing I've been meaning to tell you for 9 years and I don't know how. The crossing out, then again. Maren, I know you think I don't. Another page, dear Maren. I am not a smart man, but I am trying to learn how to say. And it stopped. The last one, only a few weeks before he died, the handwriting steadier than the others, like he'd finally been getting close. Maren, by the time I get the nerve to give you this, I want it to be wrote good enough that you'll see I meant every word. So I am practicing. A man taught me you can learn anything at any age if you are not too proud to start at the start. I should have told you this years ago. Every Sunday I drove out here, I was thinking I would come home and finally tell you what I. And there the last entry ended, mid-sentence, because he had run out of Sundays. Maren sat in the little wooden desk with the ledger in her lap, and the three-legged dog warm against her foot, and the river running gray and steady past the window, and she cried the way she had not let herself cry at the funeral, the kind of crying that comes up from a place you didn't know you had, for a man she had decided to leave because she thought he had nothing to say to her, when the truth was he had been teaching himself, at 59 years old, how a wukless write her a love letter good enough to deserve her. She had been so sure she knew him. That was the thing that hollowed her out. Not that he was gone. That she'd had him for 31 years and never once looked. The men started coming the way Royce said they would. Once word got around town that Walt's widow had found the shack and meant to keep it open. They came one at a time, in pickup trucks, in the evenings after work, and they stood on the little porch turning their caps in their hands until Maren came out. And then they told her. Hollis Pruitt came first, the 71-year-old. He was 75 now, lean and weathered, with hands like roots. I pretended for 50 years, ma'am, he said. My wife thought I just didn't like to read. Truth is I couldn't. Walt sat with me every Sunday for near 3 years. Never once made me feel stupid. The day I read the whole front page of the paper out loud to him, he didn't say nothing. He just stood up and shook my hand like I'd done something. I'm an old man. Wasn't nobody shook my hand like that since the war. Hollis looked out at the river. I read to my grandbabies now. You know what that's worth to a man? There ain't a number on it. Tyler Boone came, the young father, with the same little girl from the funeral, 4 years old now, on his shoulders. I couldn't read her a bedtime story, he said quietly, so the girl wouldn't hear. She'd hand me a book and I'd make up words off the pictures and pray she never learned to read before I figured it out. I was 26 and I couldn't read a Dr. Seuss. I'd have rather died. Somebody told me about Walt. I came out here for 9 months. Now, he reached up and patted his daughter's leg. Now she hands me a book and I read her the real words. That's Walt? That's your husband did that. There was a man named Eddie Vance who came on a Tuesday evening, a lean man in his 50s with grease worked permanently into the creases of his hands. He'd run the transmission shop on the highway for 30 years. You know how a man runs a business he can't read? He asked Maren and answered it himself. Real careful. My wife did the books. I told her my eyes were bad. 30 years I told her my eyes were bad. I had every part number in that shop memorized by the shape of the box because I couldn't read the labels. The terror of it, ma'am. A customer hands you a work order and you got about 4 seconds to figure out what it says without him knowing you can't. He looked at his hands. Walt taught me on Sundays for 2 years. First thing I read all the way through on my own was my own daughter's wedding invitation. She'd mailed it to me 6 months before, and I'd been carrying it around in my truck, pretending I'd read it. I sat in that shack and read my own girl's wedding invitation, out loud to Walt, and I had to stop twice. Eddie's jaw worked. He just waited. Didn't say a word, just waited till I could go on. There was a woman too, the only one, a widow named Carol Mott, who came not for herself but to tell Maren that Walt had quietly bent his own rule once. My husband, before he passed, he couldn't read, Carol said. And he was dying, and it ate at him that he'd never read the Bible his mother gave him. Couldn't get up to drive to the river anymore. So Paul came to us, drove out to our place every Sunday for the last 4 months of my Burl's life and sat for a kitchen table and helped him read it. A little at a time. Burl made it to the Psalms before he passed. Walt never charged a thing, never told a soul, and at the funeral he stood in the back same as he always did everywhere and slipped out before anybody could thank him. Carol pressed an envelope into Maren's hand. This is the thank you note Burl wrote him. Took Burl a week to write it. Walt kept it, and I found it in that ledger drawer, and I think you ought to have it back, but I wanted you to know what it was first. Inside the envelope, in a dying man's labored hand, were 6 words, misspelled, perfect, thank you for the words. Burl. Marvin Boyd came, the big trucker who'd found him. He couldn't talk at first. He sat on the porch step next to the 3-legged dog and scratched its good ear for a long while. Walt named that dog, he finally said. Showed up out here half-starved couple years back, missing the leg from a coyote trap. Walt fed him. I asked him what we ought to call it, and Walt looked at him a second and said, Deacon. 'Cause he shows up every Sunday and don't say a word, and somehow you still feel better he's there. Marvin laughed, wet-eyed. That was Walt all over. Quietest man I ever knew, and somehow the most words I ever learned came out of his classroom. He looked at Marin. I'm sorry I'm the one found him, Mem. I'm sorry that's how you had to picture it. But I'll tell you, his glasses were on, and his book was open, and there was a little smile on his face. He died in the one place on this earth where he wasn't pretending to be anything but exactly what he was. There's worse ways to go. There ain't many better. Every one of them, 41 men, carried a piece of her husband she'd never been given. She had married a man and lived with him 3 decades, and it took his death and a shack full of strangers to assemble him in front of her, and the man who came together out of all those pieces was nothing like the dull, distant figure she'd been quietly leaving for 9 years. He was the most patient man in 3 counties. He was a teacher. He had built something out of nothing but his own old shame turned inside out into other men's freedom, and he had done it without ever once needing a single person to know his name. Marin made up her mind. She was going to keep it open. Whatever the 3 words on the map had meant, she was going to honor them. She'd reopen Ellison's Sunday school. She'd ask Ada Finch if she was still living, how it was done. She'd let the men keep coming, and she'd keep the ledger going, and she'd write her own line under his someday. That was the plan she fell asleep on, 3 weeks a widow, for the first time at peace with the man she'd buried. And that was when Curtis Dwyer drove up the gravel turn in a white Tahoe with dealer plates and a real estate sign magnet on the door. If you've come this far, you already know somebody was going to come for this land. Stay with me, because what happened next is where the whole thing turns. Curtis was Walt's nephew, his late brother's boy, and Marin had met him exactly twice in 31 years, both times at funerals. He was about 40, soft-handed, in a quarter-zip pullover and pressed jeans and boots that had never seen a day of work. He got out of the Tahoe smiling, the kind of smile that's already doing math behind it. And he looked at the shack the way you'd look at something you were measuring for the dumpster. Aunt Marin, he said, though she'd never been his aunt in any way that counted. I heard you'd been coming out here. I've been meaning to talk to you about all this. He gestured at the 2 acres, the river, the shack, with a little wave that took it all in and dismissed it at the same time. I'll be honest with you, because I think you've got enough on your plate. This property's a problem you don't need. It's not a problem, Marin said. It's mine. Well, Curtis's smile didn't move. That's actually the thing I wanted to talk to you about. He leaned against the Tahoe and crossed his arms. Uncle Walt and I had an understanding. Some years back, he told me he wanted this to stay in the family, with somebody who could do something with it. He knew I was in real estate. He knew I'd take care of it. There was a handshake on it. Now I know that's not paperwork. But it was his intent. And I think if you search your heart you'll know Walt wouldn't have wanted this sitting here rotting. Marin didn't say anything. She just looked at him. Here's where it gets time-sensitive, Curtis went on, and now the salesman in him took over and the words came faster. There's a development group out of Branson, Hollow Bend Marina, putting in a 140-slip marina and a resort about a mile downriver. They need an access road and a staging parcel, and the engineers say the only route that works runs right through here. Right through this. He nodded at the shack. I've been working with them. They're prepared to offer, he paused, the way a man pauses before a number he wants to land hard. They're prepared to offer me, as the family representative, a position and a finder's interest if I can deliver this parcel clean. Which means, Aunt Marin, that if you'll let me handle this, there's money in it for you too. Real money. 40, maybe 50,000 for a piece of riverbank with a falling down fishing shack on it. That's a life-changing number for a woman in your situation. My situation, Marin repeated, widowed, 57. I checked, and Walt didn't leave much. I'm trying to help you. Curtis spread his hands, the picture of reason. Nobody's going to remember this old chicken coop in 5 years. But 50 grand changes your whole retirement. Let me make this easy. I've got a buy-sell already drawn up. You sign over, I handle the marina, everybody wins. Marin looked at the shack behind him. At the chalkboard through the window, the quick brown fox. At the rows of desks where 41 men had stopped being afraid. At the three-legged dog standing now in the doorway with its hackles up, a low sound coming out of it she'd never heard before. Do you know what this is? She asked Curtis quietly. It's a fishing shack. Do you know what my husband did out here? Curtis sighed, a little impatient now. Aunt Marin, I really don't have time for. He taught 41 grown men to read, she said. Men who'd hidden it their whole lives. He did it for free, on his day off, for 9 years, and he never told a single soul who didn't need to know, including me. That chalkboard is the last lesson he wrote. That book on the desk is what he was reading when his heart stopped. She let it sit there in the cold air between them. And you want to bulldoze it for an access road and call it a chicken coop. Something flickered across Curtis's face, the briefest understanding that he'd misjudged the ground he was standing on. And then he papered over it. That's a real nice story, he said. And I mean that. But a story doesn't pay taxes and it doesn't stop a marina. Look, the smile came back, thinner now. I didn't want to get into this, but I'll be straight with you. I'm not sure Walt's estate is as clean as you think. He died sudden. Did he leave a will? Because if he died without one, this property goes through probate, and as blood family, I've got standing and you've got a lawyer's bill you can't afford. Or we do this the easy way and you walk away with $50,000 in my gratitude. Your choice. Think about it. The marina people need an answer by the end of the month. He got in the Tahoe, backed it around in the red dust, and drove off, and Deacon stood in the doorway growling until the engine faded out down the gravel. Marin stood very still for a long time. Her hands were shaking, and she hated that they were shaking, because she could feel Curtis's words doing exactly what he'd built them to do, finding the soft places. A widow. Not much money, a lawyer she couldn't afford. Maybe he was right that there was no will. Maybe blood beat a wife in court. Maybe she'd lose it anyway and end up with nothing instead of $50,000. She stood there and felt the old habit rise up in her. The habit of 31 years, the habit of going quiet, of not making the fight, of sliding the folder closer to the front of the drawer and telling herself not yet. And then she looked at the chalkboard one more time, and she thought about a man who left school in the 8th grade and was so ashamed for 34 years that he memorized the shape of road signs rather than admit he couldn't read them. And who, at the age of to sit in a child's chair at a library night class and start at the start. A man taught me you can learn anything at any age if you are not too proud to start at the start. Marin Ellison was 57 years old. She had never fought for anything in her life. She decided she was not too proud to start. She started at the feed store. Royce listened to the whole thing, his jaw going tight, and when she finished he said one word, Curtis, like it tasted bad. That boy's been a buzzard since he could walk. Showed up at his own daddy's funeral asking about the truck. Then he said, Walt had a will, Marin. I know it for a fact because I'm the one witnessed it. It took 2 days to find it. It was not in a lawyer's office because Walt had never paid a lawyer in his life. It was where Marin should have known to look first, and didn't, because she still wasn't used to thinking of her husband as a man who put things in writing. It was in the Bible. Folded into the back, behind the maps of the Holy Land, behind a page he'd underlined slow and careful, was a single sheet in his block capitals. I, Walter James Ellison, being of sound mind, leave everything I own, including the 2 acres and building on Old Ferry Road, to my wife Marin. I want the school kept open as long as she is able. Witness this day, and below it 3 signatures. Walt's, Royce Tillman's, and Ada Finch's, the school teacher who had taught him to read, who it turned out was 83 years old and very much alive and living in a tidy house in Mountain Home with a yard full of bird feeders. Walt had had it notarized at the bank the same week. The notarized copy, Royce confirmed, was on file at the courthouse, where it had been for 2 years. Marin sat with that will in her hands, and the relief that went through her was so total it left her dizzy. He had protected her. 2 years ago, while she was filling out a folder in a dresser drawer, Walt had been driving to the bank to make sure that whatever happened, the land and the school and the future would come to her, and nobody else, and especially not a buzzard in a quarter zip. Keep it open. The map hadn't been an instruction to a stranger. It had been an instruction to her. He'd known she'd be the one to find it. He'd been counting on it. She could have stopped there. The will was airtight. Curtis had no standing, and once he learned about the notarized copy on file, he'd fold his hand and slink off. She could have let it die quiet, the way Walt did everything quiet. But the Marina people had filed a petition with the county to have the parcel rezoned and the access easement condemned. And there was a public meeting of the Planning Commission on the last Thursday of the month, and Marin decided that the men of Ellison Sunday School were not going to let their teacher's classroom go down without their voices in the room. She went and saw all of them. Tyler, Marvin, the truckers and the farmers and the young fathers. She told them what Curtis wanted to do, and she told them about the will. And then she asked them for something that she knew was the hardest thing in the world for men like them to give. She asked them to come to a public meeting in front of the whole county and tell what Walt had done for them. To stand up in a room full of people and admit out loud, with their names attached, that there had been a time not so long ago when they could not read. There was a long silence in Royce's feed store, where she'd gathered the dozen or so who could make it. These were men who had hidden this thing for decades, who had built whole lives around not being found out. She was asking them to undo in one night the secrecy that Walt himself had so carefully protected. She watched them look at the floor, at their boots, at each other. It was Hollis, 75 years old, who stood up first. "I pretended 50 years, he said to the room. "I'm done pretending. If standing up and saying I couldn't read till I was 71 is what it takes to save the place that fixed it, then I'll stand up. Walt never let me feel small in that room. I'll be damned if I let some boy in a Tahoe call it a chicken coop." One by one, the rest of them stood. The night before the meeting, Marin drove the 40 minutes to Mountain Home to see Ada Finch, because she was afraid, and because she didn't know how to not be afraid, and because the one person left alive who'd known Walt longest was an 83-year-old woman in a house full of bird feeders. Ada made tea and listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and when Marin finished, she set down her cup. "You're scared you'll get up there and freeze," Ada said. "It wasn't a question. I've never spoken in front of people in my life," Marin said. "I've never fought anybody for anything. Walt was the quiet one, but I was the one who went along. 31 years I went along." Ada nodded slowly. "Let me tell you something about your husband that you might not know even now," she said. "When Walt could finally read, after 2 years, he didn't celebrate. You know what he did? He came to me and he said, 'Miss Ada, I'm ashamed of all the years I let go by.' And I told him the same thing I'm going to tell you. Shame for the wasted years is just pride wearing a black coat. It's still about you. The only thing worth doing with the time you've got left is to use it." Walt didn't waste another Sunday feeling bad about the 34 years. He spent the next 25 turning lights on. She reached across and tapped the back of Marin's hand. "You spent 31 years going along. All right. You can spend the rest of them going along, or you can stand up tomorrow in that ugly little room and turn a light on. But you don't get to do both. And you don't get to spend the time you've got left being sorry about the time you didn't." Marin drove home in the dark with the heater rattling, and Ada's words sitting in her chest. And somewhere around the second cattle guard, she stopped being afraid, or rather, she stopped letting the fear make the decision. She was still afraid. She just wasn't going to go along. The Planning Commission meeting was held in the bay of the county courthouse, in a room with fluorescent lights and metal folding chairs, and a long table where 5 commissioners sat with name placards in front of them. The Hollow Bend Marina people had come up from Branson with a lawyer in a gray suit and a glossy site plan on an easel, full of little rendered sailboats and a sun setting over a resort that didn't exist yet. Curtis Dwyer sat in the front row in his pullover, looking pleased, certain this was a formality. The room filled up. Word had gotten around. By the time the meeting started, there were people standing along the back wall. The Marina lawyer went first. He talked about jobs, about tax base, about 140 boat slips, and the economic future of a county that had been bleeding young people for 30 years. He talked about a single recalcitrant parcel, standing in the way of progress, an abandoned outbuilding of no historical or economic value, and the routine condemnation of an access easement for the public good. He was smooth and he was practiced, and when he sat down, the commissioners were nodding. Then the chairman asked if anyone wished to speak in opposition, expecting, you could see it on his face, nobody. Hollis Pruitt stood up. He walked to the little podium with the microphone, an old man in a clean pressed shirt, and he took a folded piece of newspaper out of his shirt pocket, and he smoothed it out on the podium with his root-knuckled hands. "My name is Hollis Pruitt," he said. "I'm 75 years old and I've farmed in this county my whole life. 4 years ago I could not have read you a word of this." He held up the newspaper, not a word. "I faked it for 50 years. My own wife didn't know." A murmur went through the room. "There was a man named Walt Ellison built a little school out on the river and taught me my letters when I was 71 years old, for free, on his day off, and never told a soul, because he do the shame of it same as I did. I'd like to read you something." And then Hollis Pruitt, 75 years old, bent his head to the newspaper and read aloud, slowly, carefully, every word landing in the silent room, a short article about a high school baseball game. It was nothing. It was the most ordinary thing in the world. And when he finished and looked up, half the room had its hand over its mouth, because they understood what they had just watched. He sat down, and Tyler Boone stood up, and Tyler read a page from a children's book, the one about the boy and the horse, his daughter on his hip, and at the end he said, "I read this to her every night now. That's the building you want to bulldoze." And he sat down. And Marvin Boyd stood up, the big trucker, and he didn't read anything, he just said, "I found Walt the day he died. He died in that classroom teaching men like me who everybody else gave up on. You want to run a road through it. I want every person in this room to know what you'd be running it through." And he sat down. And another man stood up, and another. 11 men, one after another, stood up in the basement of the Sawyer County Courthouse and confessed, in front of their neighbors, the thing they had hidden their whole lives, and then read, out loud, to prove what had been given to them. It was the loudest argument Marin had ever heard, and not one of them raised his voice. By the time the 11th man sat down, the marina lawyer had stopped looking at his site plan. The commissioners were not nodding anymore. And Curtis Dwyer, in the front row, had gone gray in the face, because he had walked in with a chicken coop and was sitting in a room that had just turned that chicken coop into the most important building in the county. Then Marin stood up. She walked to the podium and she set down two things: the notarized will, leaving the land to her, with instructions to keep the school open, and the ledger, 41 names, each with the day the lights came on. "My husband owned that land free and clear," she said, "and he left it to me, in writing, witnessed and notarized and on file in this very building, with one instruction: keep it open. I intend to honor that instruction for as long as I'm able." She looked at the marina lawyer, and then she looked at Curtis, and she did not look away. "There's no handshake deal. There's no clean parcel to deliver. There's a will, and there's a widow, and there are 41 men in this county who can read, because of what happened in that building. You can route your road around it the way you'd route it around a church, because that's what it is." She picked up the ledger and held it against her chest. "Thank you." The Planning Commission voted 4-1 to deny the easement and to recommend the parcel for a county historical designation. The marina would be built. It just wouldn't be built through Ellison's Sunday school. Curtis Dwyer left before the vote was finished. Marin never heard from him again, except for a single voicemail a week later, his voice smaller than she'd ever heard it, saying only, "I didn't know what it was. I want you to know I didn't know." She did not call him back, but she didn't delete it either. A man could be a buzzard and still, somewhere down at the bottom of him, be ashamed. She knew something about shame now, and about how a person could be more than the worst thing you'd decided about them. She'd been wrong about that her whole marriage. She wasn't going to start being sure of people again now. Ada Finch came to the shack that spring, 83 years old, brought by Royce in his truck, to see the place her oldest student had built out of what she'd given him. She walked between the rows of desks slowly with a cane, and she stopped at the chalkboard and read The Quick Brown Fox and laughed, a dry, happy sound. "I taught him that sentence," she said. "Got every letter in the alphabet. He must have taught it to all of them." She turned to Marin. "Your husband was the best student I ever had. You know why? Not because he was the smartest. Because he was the least proud. A proud man can't learn. He's too busy protecting what he doesn't know." Walt walked classroom at 34 and sat down in a child's chair and said, "Ma'am, I can't read. Will you teach me?" And there wasn't a speck of pride in him to get in the way. Ada put her old hand on Marin's arm. "You keep this open, you hear? There's still men in this county sitting in the dark. They'll come if there's a light on." Marin kept it open. She talked to Ada about how it was done, and she talked to Marvin and Hollis and Tyler, the ones who'd been taught and could now help teach, and by summer Ellison's Sunday school was running again. Sunday mornings, 11 miles south of town, with the wood stove going in the cool months and the river window open in the warm ones, and Deacon the three-legged dog asleep under the desk where he'd always slept. The men still told their wives they were going fishing, some of them in the beginning, but fewer every year. Because the thing that Walt had built in secret out of shame, Maren was slowly building in the open out of pride. The good kind, the kind that says there is no shame in starting at the start at any age, and the men were starting, a few at a time, to believe it. She learned to teach. She wasn't a natural the way Walt had been. She was impatient at first, and she had to learn the patience the way he must have learned it, one frustrated Sunday at a time. She learned that you never finished a man's sentence for him, no matter how long he hung on a word, because the whole point was that he got there himself. She learned to keep her face still and her voice low and to say, when a man finally broke a hard word into its pieces and put it back together right, only that. Only there it is, the way Ada had said it to Walt, the way Walt had said it to 41 men, the smallest words in the world and somehow the heaviest. She learned which men needed her to sit close and which needed her to sit across the room and pretend to read her own book, so they didn't feel watched. She learned that the river window, which she'd thought was for the view, was really so that a man could look out at the water for a second when his eyes got wet and not have to explain why. The first time she sat beside a 48-year-old roofer named Dell and watched him read his way through a whole short book on his own, sounding out the hard words, his finger under the line, and watched his face change when he got to the last page, and realized he'd done it. She understood, finally and completely, what her husband had driven 11 miles every Sunday for 9 years to feel. Dell got to the end and shut the book, and sat there a second, and then he looked up at her, and he didn't say anything, and neither did she, because there wasn't anything to say that would be bigger than what had just happened in that little wooden He had a daughter in junior high, Dell did, who'd been quietly reading his mail to him for years, and covering for him at the bank, a kid carrying a grown man's secret. The next Sunday, Dell told Maren that he'd read his daughter's report card himself for the first time, out loud at the supper table, and that the girl had started crying and wouldn't say why, but he knew why. He knew exactly why. The lights coming on, there was no number on it. Curtis had been right about that without knowing it. There was no number on it at all. The marina got built, a mile downriver, 140 slips, and a restaurant with a deck and a parking lot full of out-of-county trucks on summer weekends. Maren went down to look at it once. It was fine. It was what it was. The boats came and the money came and the young people got some jobs, and none of it touched the 2 acres on the bend where the cedar pressed down to the water and the shack stood gray and quiet with a chalkboard inside. The county put up a small brown historical marker at the gravel turn that read Ellison Denominity School, East 2015, and most of the people who drove past it on their way to the marina never gave it a second glance, never knew, and that, Maren thought, was exactly as Walt would have wanted it. He'd spent his whole life making sure nobody knew. He'd have liked a marker that nobody read. She found the folder that summer when she finally cleaned out the dresser. The divorce papers, 9 years old, soft at the creases, everything filled out but the signature line. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at them for a long time, the way she'd looked at the deed the day she found it. Then she took them out to the shack, and she opened the wood stove, and she fed them in page by page, and watched them burn, and she did not feel triumphant, and she did not feel guilty. She felt the way you feel when you finally set down something you've been carrying so long you forgot it was heavy. She had been so sure she knew him. She had almost left him over a secret that turned out to be the most beautiful thing about him. She would carry that, the almost, for the rest of her life, but she would carry it the way you carry a scar, not a wound. Proof you'd been somewhere and come back changed. In the front of the ledger, Walt had written Ellison's Sunday School, started April 2015, and on the last page he'd ever written, the practice letter to her trailed off mid-sentence. Every Sunday I drove out here, I was thinking I would come home and finally tell you what I, and stopped, forever, in his careful hard-won hand. Maren took a pen, on a Sunday evening in the fall, after the last man had driven off down the gravel turn and the river had gone gold and then gray in the window. She turned to a fresh page near the back, after his 41 names, after his unfinished letter. She thought about what to write for a long time, and then she wrote her own line under his. Maren Ellison, kept it open. Started teaching April 2025, and below that, because she was answering the sentence he never got to finish, the only way left to answer it. I know what you were going to tell me, Walt. I found it in every name in this book. I should have looked sooner. I'm looking now." She closed the ledger and set it on the desk beside his glasses, which he had never moved and never would. Deacon stirred under the desk and put his chin on her foot. Outside, the river ran on toward the marina they'd built a mile downstream, and the cedar smell came through the open window, sharp and clean, the smell she'd spent 31 years thinking was just where her husband disappeared to, and now knew was the smell of the one place on earth where he had never, not once, pretended to be anything but exactly what he was. She had buried a man she thought she knew, with $211 in her account, and a folder in her drawer, and a verdict in her heart she'd spent 9 years writing against him. She had $11 more than that now, and a will and a school, and a 3-legged dog, and 41 men who would have stood in front of God and the county to defend her husband's name, and a community that knew, finally, what Walter Ellison had been doing on Sundays. She had been wrong about almost everything that mattered, and she had been given, by a folded deed in a Bible she'd never opened, the rarest thing a person ever gets. A second chance to know someone she'd already lost. Marin turned off the lamp on the desk. She locked the door of the shack with the key Royce had given her, the same key half the men in the county carried, and she stood on the little porch for a moment in the cool dark, with Deacon beside her, and looked out at the water. The lights were off in the classroom now, but they'd come on again Sunday. They always would, as long as she was able. She was 57 years old, and she was not too proud to start. She drove home in the dark, 11 miles north, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the silence in the truck didn't feel like something missing. It felt like something kept. Here is what that quiet man left behind, and it was never the 2 acres or the shack or the river. Walter Ellison spent 34 years believing that the thing he could not do made him less of a man, and he wasted 3 decades hiding it from the people who loved him. Then a patient woman taught him that you can begin anything at any age, if you are not too proud to start at the start, and that one lesson turned the rest of his life inside out. He learned to read at 34. He taught 41 others before he was done, and the only reason his own wife almost left him was that he carried his learning the way he'd carried his shame, in silence, alone, certain that no one would understand. So if there is one thing to take from Marin and Walt, let it be these 2 things, because they are the same thing turned 2 ways. First, it is never too late to learn, and there is no shame in not knowing yet, only in being too proud to begin. And second, do not decide you know a person by how quiet they've gone. Silence is not the same as having nothing to say. Sometimes the people who say the least are carrying the most, and the only way you will ever know is to keep knocking on the door long after you've convinced yourself the room behind it is empty. Walt never got to finish his letter, but Marin finished it for him, every Sunday in a small room on a bend of the river, one more set of lights at a time. And that is the truest inheritance any of us can leave. Not what we own, what we teach. Keep it open.